So, I want to have this conversation with you because you're one of the leading brand strategists in the outdoor industry, and you led strategy at Origin, where you worked on campaigns for some of the biggest brands in the outdoors. And most of the people who listen to this podcast are working within the smaller brands and with smaller budgets. But my hope is that you can help us have a better understanding of what branding and marketing is so that we can apply it to our own businesses. And I know that we'll barely scratch the surface in an hour of conversation, but I'll do my best to get out of the way and just let you teach the masterclass. So, to start, I'm curious, what are the skills and character traits that make you uniquely capable of being a great brand strategist?
Yeah, well, hey, first of all, thanks for having me, man. This is a big fan of what you guys are
Cool.
doing out in the Kootenays there, and appreciate you having me on. So, yeah, in terms of kind of my background and what kind of qualified me or inspired me to get into this field, I've always had a knack at being able to um, kind of think like a consumer and put myself in the shoes of the consumer. And I think since I was young, I kind of had a realization that there was something about brands that was interesting to me, and there was a reason that I was attracted to certain brands and not attracted to other brands. And I guess as I kind of became more self-aware around that, I looked into it a little bit more to try and understand what it was, and I think that's sort of a little part of what led me into the marketing and branding field. I remember being like a kid, like growing up, snowboarder in the 90s and 2000s. I was always scribbling like forum logos and Foursquare logos and Special Blend logos on my notebooks. And I was from that age, I was kind of interested in these brands. And yeah, that kind of led me into the field of marketing.
Cool. And like, as your career has gone on, like, what's your special sauce? Like, I mean, I don't want to give away your secrets, but like, what are the things now that you feel like you're uniquely capable at doing, and then you can kind of step into a room with people in a brand and say, I hear what
Yeah,
you're saying, but have you thought about it like this? I mean, do you have a
yeah.
spidey sense that you kind of rely on?
A lot of it is that kind of heuristic gut side of it. Obviously, marketing and strategy, like there's a foundation in data and research that's critically important. We need to have something to base our opinions on, but strategy is largely driven by insights. And insight is a really interesting word. It gets thrown around a lot, but I really like to differentiate between facts and insights. Like a fact is something that the data tells you. Data doesn't tell you an insight. Insight is your interpretation of the information and the data that's provided to you, whether that's like literal physical data that you're getting from, numbers or research information or user information on a website or something like that, or whether that's data that you're getting through qualitative conversations with people, talking to people on share lists, talking to stakeholders within an organization. The but you're not getting insights out of that. You're getting data and information. Insights is about how you apply your own understanding of the market, your own understanding of branding in the industry to that information to try and find something more meaningful. And again, I think that comes back to just really to answer your question about what's my special sauce or my kind of sweet spot. I think that by being able to combine a lot of the things that I'm passionate about in my own lifestyle, snowboarding, surfing, hunting, fishing, all of those things that I grew up doing, just being a passionate kind of outdoorsman, um, has always helped me really understand the outdoor industry, the outdoor consumer, but then having the training and the background and the interest in the marketing field and being able to bring sort of a lot of the marketing and branding things that I've learned over, man, coming up on 20 years doing this on the agency side and bringing that to brands paired up with that kind of just inherent understanding of the industry and the outdoor consumer, I think is where most of my clients find that value. They don't have to try and explain the consumer. They don't have to try and explain their business. That's just something I come to the table with. And then I'm able to pair that up with what you might get from, a more traditional big agency or even like some of the management consultants out there in terms of an understanding of business strategy, brand strategy, marketing strategy. and that's just kind of helped me be successful in this space, I guess, and have that level of comfort discussing those kinds of things with C-suite people in the outdoor industry. You know, I don't look like a I don't look like a management consultant. I got long hair and a beard, and I wear hoodies and things like that. And I think sometimes people are a little bit like, "Who's this guy?" But like I said, that's a little bit of who I am and what I do and what I'm interested in. So I kind of like that. I like being able to surprise people. Maybe on the surface, I don't look like a brand strategist, but I've been successful in that way.
Maybe it's helpful to back up a little bit and just clearly define, because it's a word that we talk about all the time, but I'd like to hear it from your perspective. And this is a huge question. You could probably spend an hour talking about this very topic. So we'll do our best here. So, what is branding as you defined it, and why does branding matter?
Totally. Yeah. So branding is a term that gets thrown out a lot, and a lot of people interpret it in different ways. I think one of the most common, maybe just kind of starting with kind of a misunderstanding about branding and the way that it gets used, and it's not necessarily wrong. It's just only like a portion of the pie. A lot of people talk about branding just in the sense of a logo or like an identity, or even kind of like the creative expression of a brand in terms of what you see in advertising or content or social media marketing, all of those things. That's really just a very small piece of what branding is, and in fact, that's I'll kind of talk about a little bit of my branding model later on, but that's kind of what I consider to be just a part of the outward expression of a brand. But the brand is so much deeper than that, and what a brand really is it's just kind of in the mind of the consumer, a brand is just a summation of every experience they have with that entity, whether it's an organization, like whether it's a person. People have brands, especially like as we're seeing things move in the direction with athletes kind of taking on a lot more of their own personal branding and how they manage their social media presence and things like that. 100% people have brands. But in the traditional sense of an organization or a company, yeah, the brand is really just the summation of all of the experiences the consumer has with that entity. If you kind of take that back into the side of how an organization manages their brand and why we invest money into branding, fundamentally it's really a method of adding value to your product or service above and beyond the basic functional attributes of what you do. So when I talk about functional attributes, like let's say you're an outerwear brand, you make jackets and bibs and pants and things like that. Your product has a very basic functional benefit to the consumer. It keeps them dry, it keeps them warm, whatever that is. But what the brand does is it allows you to add a whole bunch of value on top of just those basic functional attributes. It allows you to kind of communicate a value proposition that's more than that, and it allows you to differentiate yourself from your competitors. So why is somebody choosing, like if you look at Gore-Tex shells, six, $700 Gore-Tex shells, like they're pretty much they're all at parity. There's not really any that one that they use the same materials. Sure, there's some aesthetic differences, some fit differences and stuff like that, but the product is essentially a commodity at this point. So branding allows you to differentiate that commodity, add value, build loyalty with your consumers. That loyalty ultimately, lowers your customer acquisition costs. It lowers your marketing costs. It does all of that. It also gets confused as just being like gets lumped in with marketing a lot, but it's totally different than marketing. Marketing, it's kind of a subset of marketing. Marketing is just a general term that just means building demand for a product or a service. There's lots of ways to build demand through marketing. There's like traditional marketing things that you see in content and advertising. There's things like pricing and promotion strategy. There's distribution strategy. Where you put your product is an element, a function of marketing. Branding is really a much longer term strategy than just what you're doing in sort of your immediate marketing. And I really look at branding as like it's a thing that defines the deeper meaning of your company. And it's really a long tail play in building a brand. It definitely doesn't happen overnight. That's one of, you know, maybe another misconception of branding is that you can just sort of sit down in a branding session, build your brand, and there you go. You've got it. It takes a long time to build a brand and it takes an investment, but it can also become one of the most valuable assets that your organization owns. So, you know, you may think of it as an expense in terms of like the work that goes into brand building in the same way that like marketing is an expense. But branding actually is like a brand is an asset in and of itself. Look at like, so think about Apple. I was just looking at this yesterday. Apple has a market cap of $3.5 trillion, which seems insane. Um, if you look at the way that the actual brand, the intangible asset of the Apple brand has been valued, they have a $1 trillion brand equity value. So their brand, this completely intangible thing that they made up, it like it doesn't, like it doesn't exist in anywhere other than the mind of the consumer and the minds of the people at Apple that are managing it. It's worth almost a third of their market valuation. Coca-Cola is another big one. So think of it not just as like a marketing expense, which is the way a lot of people think of it. They're like, God damn, I gotta spend money on brands. It's like, no, like you're actually building something that could be worth more than like all of the other different, tangible assets, capital assets that you have in your business if you do it right. And if people are thinking, especially like I know you have a lot of startups, like solopreneurs, entrepreneurs listening to this podcast, as you're thinking about building a brand, building an organization, maybe with one day with the goal of selling that for kind of a capital return. The brand may actually be one of the most valuable assets that you've invested in and built.
Yeah, 100% agree. As somebody who just sold a business, that yeah, the
Yeah,
goodwill of the business
totally.
is the brand gets wrapped up in that, and that is especially for a small
Yeah,
business, it's a huge portion of what you're selling. So it's super important. There's another term that
absolutely.
I've heard you and I've talked about it before, and I hear it kicking around, and I'm ignorant to it. I'd like for you to help me understand a little bit more. Is the idea of consumer psychology and how it relates to branding? Because
Hmm.
it kind of gets thrown around in that kind of data and insight conversation.
Totally. Yeah. The psychology side or the consumer behavior side of it is um that's really, I mean, consumer behavior is kind of a field of study that looks at the reasons that people make the consumption decisions that they do. And that's, those decisions exist at both kind of conscious levels and then like unconscious or subconscious levels. You can also look at them as like rational decisions and irrational decisions. And it's really just the study of why are people making those consumption decisions that they do? And then how can we leverage that information, that understanding to help influence consumption decisions, which is, again, really what marketing and branding is all about. I like to think about consumer behavior um, kind of existing on the spectrum of decision making. And like I said, on one end, you kind of have this functional or rational decision making, and this is definitely a spectrum. It's not sort of like a categorization of one or the other. It all falls on some level of the spectrum, and there can be all kinds of variables and factors that influence a person's decision. But yeah, on one end, you've got kind of this rational, functional decision making. I'm buying this jacket because it keeps me dry, it keeps me warm. Or it's available at the store I'm at. It's the price that I'm looking for. It's just fulfilling those basic needs. On the other end, you got all these like irrational or emotionally driven factors that influence the decision. And that's really where a lot of the branding comes in. That's things like, how does this brand make me feel? What deeper meanings am I associating with the brand of the product that I'm purchasing? What does it tell other people about me that I choose this brand? What does it tell me about myself, in a sort of self-actualizing way that I choose this brand? There are all these kind of different pieces that drive, functional and or emotional decision making. So I often look at brands and consider, where they fall on that scale, where they want to be on that scale, and how we help build all of those different pieces to influence those different types of consumer decisions. And I could talk a little bit in here, like I can nerd out on this stuff, but I think uh, an interesting model that if you want to get into like a little bit of the deeper psychology without, you know, seeing a shrink, basically, Um, a model that you can use is, well, like a lot of people have heard of Maslow. He's kind of a famous historical figure in psychology, and he has something called the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And essentially, what that is, it categorizes all human needs into a five-tier hierarchy. It's often displayed as a pyramid. Um, and at the base of that pyramid, you have kind of the most fundamental needs that all people have. And at the top, you have sort of like what we call self-actualizing needs, which are really, it's like you've achieved enlightenment when you get there. So there's these five tiers, and you've got at the bottom, you've got these psycho or physiological needs. These are things like just basic physiological needs like food, shelter, clothing, sleep. Then it kind of bumps up to safety and security. You got things like your health, your physical security, your financial security, your emotional security. Next tier up is love and belonging. That's kind of the need to feel accepted, the need to feel, have relationships, to have trust, to have intimacy, those things that start to become a little bit more like, you're getting away from these basic functional needs and starting to get into some more emotionally led needs. Above that, you've got self-esteem. That's kind of the ability to have confidence in yourself, esteem of yourself, to have achievements, to have respect, respect yourself, have other people respect you, and start to really define this kind of unique sense of yourself, who you are, how you show up and exist in the world. And then again, like I said, at the very top of that pyramid of needs is self-actualization. That's kind of this realization of your full potential. It's where things like your purpose in life, your morality, your accomplishments, how you feel fulfilled come in, and you hear a lot of people talking about like, yeah, I don't have a purpose in life. I'm lost or whatever. Like that's really, they've covered off a lot of those basic needs. They've got food and security. They've got people around them that love them. They may feel confident in what they do, but they're like, man, what am I doing in this world? Like, what is my purpose? That's kind of when you're getting to those self-actualizing needs. And that is really relevant in consumer behavior because brands can connect any number of those needs from the most basic physical needs all the way up to those self-esteem and self-actualizing needs. And the way we build brands is, or the way I build brands at least, is largely related to that in terms of thinking about the need fulfillment at those different levels. So I could talk a little bit more about that and give some more tangible examples if
Yeah,
that's
I mean that's
helpful
for
too.
tangible. What was going on in my mind when you're saying that is, okay, I have a small brand with a small budget. I don't have access to
Yeah.
consumer research like bigger brands. I can't do big kind of
Yeah,
review processes. Like, how do I tap into that
totally.
as a small brand? Just like, is it? Do I create the customer persona that I am aiming for, or do I go to the market and
Yeah.
say, okay, who instead of telling the market what I think they want, I actually is it more efficient to go and actually find out who's already connecting with your brand?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so a few different things there. I mean, yeah, I've worked on both sides of this spectrum where I've worked with brands that have massive consumer insight divisions. Like they have tens of groups of people working within the brand purely focused on getting an understanding of who their consumer is and why they make the decisions that they do. I've also worked with a bunch of solopreneurs and small brands that have none of that. Right? They're just winging it. And obviously, anytime you can get any kind of data or information to help you inform your decisions, that's valuable. Mm, But there's also the flip side to that is kind of the old adage, like the Henry Ford adage that like if I'd asked people what they needed, they would have told me they wanted a faster horse. Consumers can only tell you so much. And I talked a lot about a lot of the sort of subconscious or unconscious decision making that goes on. Sit around and ask people in a focus group why they buy a Patagonia jacket. You'll get some people telling you about sustainability and those things, but like consumers are not inherently very good at having the deep level of self-awareness to analyze their behavior at a those higher, more emotionally driven, more irrational driven levels of their kind of consumption behavior. So one of the things that's unique about the outdoor industry, compared to a lot of other industries, is a lot of people in it are there because they're super passionate about what they're doing. There's probably not too many people that work at like 3M or Honeywell or whatever that are super passionate about whatever the heck the chemicals and consumer
Scotch tape.
electronic, fans and stuff like that. Yeah, Scotch tape, whatever, that are like, man, I really understand the Scotch tape consumer because I've lived that in that world. So like a lot of us in this industry, we are the consumer or we know the space really well. So for smaller entrepreneurs who don't have access to that information, you can apply what you know about the consumer because you are them. You can also just go out and talk to people, talk to your friends who are in that space, talk to other kind of small business owners in that space, and just build a more of a heuristic understanding, like a gut understanding of the consumer, and work off of that because a lot of times, honestly, that is way more valuable than all the research data in the world. I would say I've spent hours and hours poring over research. It's oftentimes those heuristic insights are what allows me to interpret that research and really add that data and really add like a meaning to it. And there's no reason that a small business owner with a finely tuned sense of being able to tap into an understanding of the consumer can't do that, better than a massive brand can.
This is slightly deviating, but it is something that came to my mind. Is I'm wondering, is it even possible to build a brand without putting a product into the world? Like, do you have to have that kind of echo to come, like that sonar bounce back from a consumer out in the world before you can actually start to build a brand around it? Or do you think it's possible to put the building blocks together of a brand before you actually have to go to
Uh,
market?
100%, 100%, man. I mean, there's all kinds of examples out there. Like at the end of the day, you're there for a reason. You're offering something to the consumer. You probably have some kind of business model around it if you're doing it, unless you're just doing it out of the goodness of your heart. But you can think about media brands, like people, content providers. A lot of times, those are people that are building a brand around something much more intangible than a sort of product that's for sale. But on the product side, like I actually had a call the other day with a guy who was he's trying to figure out how to build a brand around a passion that he has for sailing and just kind of ocean adventures. And he doesn't really have a product. Like he just wants to make some t-shirts with some logos and some graphics and stuff like that. So, you know, like yes, there's a product aspect to it. Like the idea he has, part of his business model is to sell merch. But what he's really trying to do is build a brand that people connect to and people will see themselves in. It appeals to their passions, it appeals to their higher emotional attributes on that hierarchy of needs. And I mean, think about like a t-shirt is a total commodity. You can spend anywhere from $5 to hundreds of dollars on a t-shirt. Why are you choosing to buy the t-shirts that you do? Why are you choosing to wear somebody else's logo and essentially be like a walking billboard for them and paying $40 to do that for somebody? A lot of times that's because that person believes in that brand and they are projecting a whether they're doing it consciously or subconsciously, they're projecting a set of values and beliefs to outwards into the world by the logo they wear on their t-shirt.
Yeah, I guess I'm answering my own question by
So
saying that
yeah.
we're seeing it now like in content creators, where content creators have created a brand for
Mhm.
themselves, created an audience, and then they go out and find the
Mm,
product beyond just the content. They're creating content essentially for free, and then all of a sudden they've amassed an audience and a brand affiliation, for lack of a better
totally.
term. And then they're like, oh, I'm gonna start selling them stuff, and that's why we have all these content creator led brands now. So maybe yeah, you've answered my question. Thank you.
No, you're spot on. And I would actually argue that if you're not thinking about that, you're kind of missing the boat because if you're just going out to build a product and you're not thinking about brand, there's a bunch of things, a bunch of opportunities that you're missing out on. There's a bunch of risks that you're exposing yourself to. So when I was talking about that spectrum of needs, a lot of I see this a lot with solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, small businesses, especially in the outdoor space. They have an idea for product, and that product, um, works out really well. Like they spend a bunch of time investing, doing R&D, doing product development, design, all that. They come up with something that's really cool. Maybe it's innovative, it's unique, whatever. And they build something and they focus, because they probably come from more of that tinkerer, engineer, product development side. They maybe aren't a business, they don't have a brand and marketing background. That's kind of what they spend all their time doing, and then they put it out to the world to sell, and they may get some success, right? They may, for whatever reason, they've tapped into a need that people see for a product maybe that wasn't there, that's a better version of an existing product, and they do well, maybe off the front, they start selling product. But what happens when like competitor X starts looking at you and goes, we can do that. Like we can make that change to our product and basically have a product on parity with this. So it may work in the short term, but in the long term, how that brand then continues to grow, how that brand continues to be differentiated and successful, a lot of that is going to be about the work that they've put into articulating and establishing their brand. And like I said earlier, it's a long-term play, but it comes back to that idea of like you're building true equity by investing in something that is bigger than the product you sell. It also will guide you and become a little bit of like your North Star in terms of where you take your business. You start with product X and you start looking at product Y and product Z. It's like, are these opportunities a fit for our brand? Like, sure, there's a hole in the market where we could create this other thing and go and chase this other market opportunity. But like, is that us? Does that fit with our brand and our ethos? And it's actually a big problem that I think is part of the reason that the outdoor industry is hurting so bad right now, is there are too many brands, and we can talk more. This is a whole nother conversation, but there are too many brands chasing market opportunities that do not fit with their brand ethos because they're succumbing to, you know, pressures from VCs or stakeholders or whatever it is to grow and to chase opportunity. And a lot of times they do that and they end up tanking their brand because I mean, just look at what's happening right now. I don't know if you've seen this, like this is maybe it's like more in the like large scale outdoor industry and surf, but um if this is a whole nother rabbit hole to go down, but I'll try and sum it up simply is that you got brand like Vulcan, Quicksilver,
Yeah.
Billabong. Um, they all started as these passion-oriented brands, skateboarders, surfers,
Selling
whatever,
t-shirts.
creating t-shirts, merch, and those brands grew and grew and grew. And the way that business model eventually works is they get acquired by some private equity group or whatever it is. That private equity group starts trying to figure out how to minimize costs and grow market share and get their t-shirts in every freaking shop and all around the world. And they licensed the rights to produce their apparel out to a group called Liberated Brands. Liberated Brands took that licensing right. They started mass producing garbage quality apparel. They started selling it wherever they can. They created their own retail outlets that are a lot of times they're these clearance outlets are essentially like a Ross Dress for Less or a TJ Maxx or sorry, I'm showing my American side here because I forget what the Canadian version of
Winners,
that
baby.
is. It's like the Winners, yeah. They basically are just like and they just tank the brand because they are chasing, short-term market opportunity. And yeah, what happened in the last couple of weeks is Liberated Brands is went bankrupt. They're upside down. They're liquidating their inventory. If you want cheap Billabong or Ruka or Volcom t-shirts right now, go to their website because everything's 50% off. um, so yeah, they've kind of destroyed that brand, and now Authentic Brand Groups, which is the holding company that owns those brands, has to figure out what are we doing? What are we doing now? Like, how do we rebuild equity in these brands? Because these brands that were pretty much their only value was the brand, because they're not even creating the product. They're licensing that out to some random company that makes like it's the same company that makes like Tommy Hilfiger and whatever, I don't know, Izod and like a lot of those whatever brands you might find in Winners. They just license that out. So they don't even have any real capital equity other than just what the brand is. And now they've tanked that. So it's going on all over the outdoor industry, man. It's really sad to see. And it's a whole nother bigger conversation we can have about what that looks like and some of my thoughts on that. But
Yeah, I want to go back to the
trying to think how we
yeah, no,
even
I want to
get
go back to
there.
the idea of like this garage tinker because that description you gave of the coming out with a product, it's like I've got this great product idea. That is 100% how
Yeah,
a lot of small businesses in the outdoor industry or whatever industry start is like I have an idea for this one. I'm going to solve this one problem. I'm going to do it really well.
yeah,
There's tons of
totally.
evidence of those brands then or those businesses turning on to be a long-term brand after the fact, right? And we could probably go
Yeah,
back and say, yeah, there was some luck involved, but there was probably also some really smart brand building from the very beginning that allowed them to kind of turn product A into product B, C, D. Are there any building blocks, kind of like universal building blocks for that garage tinkerer that we could talk to? Is like, hey, you're about to, you got this great product. We need to help you build a brand. Here are the first few universal building blocks that you need to be thinking about when you go to develop your brand.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you bang on like the outdoor industry. It's full of massive brands, right? Like the North Face and like I said, Vulcan and Quicksilver and stuff like that. But most of them started with kind of passionate outdoor enthusiasts that wanted to do something different, wanted to communicate, aspects of a lifestyle through a brand, wanted to build a product that met the needs of, O'Neill wetsuits, like right, started by this dude that was living in Santa Cruz and was like, just thought he could build a better wetsuit for surfing. Or I think he even invented, like, he invented the leash too. So yeah, you come up with this idea, and so yeah, your question is kind of what are the basic building blocks for creating that brand? There's a lot of jargon in branding. It can be really complex, and there's a lot of branding firms out there that have all of these like proprietary processes, and you pay tens of thousands of dollars to get sort of a brand strategy articulated. Um, One of the things I find, especially with kind of smaller brands or brands that are led by product people who aren't like inherently don't have a formal education in branding and marketing, is they just find that like really overwhelming, and they just have no idea what the heck to do with it. They're like, okay, so like let's say you did scrape together some um the ability to invest in a brand building process, and you get this deck back from your branding agency that's like, here's your values, here's your like attributes, here's your da 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 da, and they're like, I don't even know what to do with this. So years back, I was kind of sick of doing that. I was sick of creating these brand platforms that like nobody really understood what they meant, and people would like sit around and argue about whether that was a value or an attribute or an essence or whatever. And I worked with a couple of some like younger strategists that I was mentoring at the time, and we built out this model that is a model for building brands that's based on I don't know if you've ever heard of Simon Sinek, and he has this like golden circle thing, which is it's essentially like a series of concentric circles. On the outside is what you do, the next circle in is how you do it, and the core of the concentric circles is why you do it. And his whole thing is people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So that really is just a very probably I should have started with that at the beginning of this conversation. It's a really easy way to summarize consumer behavior. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And we essentially just built a branding model around that idea and just added a couple elements to help articulate branding. So we have this model that's, I call it what, who, how, why. It's a pyramid. We love pyramids and frameworks in marketing and strategy. But on the base of that pyramid is what you do. That's your brand attributes. So that's usually really easy for, if I'm sitting down with a solopreneur, a small startup, with a couple of really good products, we can usually sit down and start talking about what the product is, what's the benefit of it. It's faster, it's lighter, it's stronger, whatever. But we start with getting those attributes down, because fundamentally you gotta kind of know what you have, right? To build a brand around it. Then we layer on the next kind of tier of the pyramid is who we do it for. That's where we start to really define the audience. So like last time you and I were talking, I mentioned there's like a guy that's been popping up in my feeds that I think he's out in the Coonies. He came up with a design for like a really high end gator. You know, it goes over your boots, and it's like he's a big hunter, and the application is really in like backcountry hunting. And he's just whatever combination of fabrics and fit and design and stuff like that. He's got a new gator, right? So you can start by thinking about like what you do, the gator, the reasons that it's better. Can start looking at who you do it for. Okay, in his his application, because of where he's focused on, is primarily going to be like kind of backcountry hunters who are looking for a better fitting, lighter gator, all that kind of stuff. Start to really build out like the audience profile, like you mentioned that previously, the kind of the persona of that consumer, what their pain points are, what they're doing, how they're using the product, what competitors they might be looking at when they're thinking about it, but also really understanding like what are their values, what are their personal things that matter to them, their ethos, a lot of hunters are really interested in conservation. Like even just looking at stuff like that. Okay, these are guys that probably spend a lot of time thinking about conservation. They probably spend a lot of time planning these adventure hunts, etc. Just get those things down on paper of who we are building the brand for. Um, Next, we start looking at how we do it. So we got what, who, how. How we do it starts to look at our differentiating values, are the behaviors of how we act as an organization, the way we show up in the world. So that's where we can start layering in things like um, gonna kind of venture off of the gator example, but like, okay, maybe we focus on sustainability. You know, our way of doing it is sustainability, or our way of doing it is like constant innovation, or any of these values or kind of ethos that we apply to the way we build, design products, operate our business, that are essentially kind of like our special sauce that make us different in the world. And then once we kind of have those three layers of the pyramid, we start to get up to the top layer, which is why we do it. And that's where, a lot of people who are kind of in the marketing or business world are probably at least heard of the concept of brand purpose. That's where we start laddering up to those aspects of brand purpose. It's our reason for, I always like to call it like, what's your reason for existing in the world beyond profit? Like if you're a business, why are you doing this? If you didn't need the money, if you had all money in the world, would you, like a lot of these people would probably still be doing this because they're passionate about it. So, what is that passion? What is that purpose? How is it influencing everything we do? Because going back to that whole people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. That's what we're ultimately trying to ladder up to. And I've just found that by distilling it down into that what we do, who we do it for, how we do it, and why we do it, and, there are like there's jargon associated with those. We get into like brand attributes, brand behaviors, brand values, like a lot of those things, but they're connected to these fundamental ideas that are much easier to understand: what, who, how, and why. It just makes it easier for brands to apply that. We kind of ladder all of that up into this singular idea that I call the brand essence. And that is really based on the idea that like consumers, while they do, there's a lot of consumer behavior going on here, like their time is precious. The moments that they spend with and thinking about a brand are fleeting. That brand needs to be able to be distilled into like one or a short combination of words that is super meaningful and is ultimately like the core of the brand's DNA. And it's really hard to get to that, but we spend a lot of time building off of that pyramid and distilling it to that tip of the pyramid, that tip of the spear of what our essence is and what is the iconic idea or concept that we're going to be known for in the industry by our consumers. Just to give a really good example of an essence outside of the outdoor industry, but one of the brands that has I think one of the strongest essence in branding is Disney. Their essence is magic, which is cool. It's a totally like ethereal concept. It has nothing to do with the product that they make or sell. But everything that Disney does is inspired by this essence of magic, from their parks to their films to the content that they're like. Obviously, they're broadening out into like content studios and stuff like that, but still at the core of that brand is this idea of magic. And like, remember I said before, the brand almost becomes your North Star, your guide of like where you go. You can use that essence as your litmus test for every decision you make as an organization. Like, does this decision align with our brand essence? So yeah, that's kind of how we build the underlying brand strategy that defines the brand and how we are going to exist in this world. And then we can start thinking about how we're actually going to show up. Because a lot of that, like the strategy is, it's like it's almost it's internal. Like it's kind of think of it like an iceberg. Like all of that strategy work is what's below the water. The consumer doesn't see it, but it's what's getting us to the tip of the iceberg that the consumer does see. And then we can start talking about things like logos, identities, colors, fonts, photography style, communication materials, website, content, like all of the, all of the different touch points, retail experience, hang tags on the product, like all of the different ways that the consumer does interact with the brand, then we can start thinking about that. But if we don't know what's underneath the surface, holding that iceberg up, it's really difficult to get a clear definition of the way that that brand is going to show up in the world in like a meaningful, cohesive way. So yeah, that's kind of the like back to your question of like where does a brand start or where does an organization start? There's a process out there for building brands, and like you don't honestly like you don't need someone like me to do this. Like if you don't have the funds, sit down and answer those questions. What do you do? Who do you do it for? How do you do it? And why do you do it? And you can get a lot of the foundational elements of a brand on paper, sitting down with some of your buddies or your stakeholders in your company for a few hours in a room and brainstorming and all that stuff. That's essentially what we do. We're just, I've just been doing it for long enough that I'm good at articulating that in a way that's meaningful. But those are the core building blocks of
That's amazing.
branding.
That's a masterclass. I was going to ask you, what would you do if you had a 1 day workshop on branding, but you just did it in like 10 minutes or less than 10 minutes. So that's impressive.
Well, that is it. That's it, man. That's a large part of what I do is I do these workshops that are, yeah, we do a lot of brand envisioning workshops. But I guess like one thing I would say, because you just gave me a day to do it, the brand workshop's usually a half day. I mean, it can take a full day sometimes, but the other thing I would encourage brands to do before you even start thinking about like that branding process, I always try to bring it back to vision. You really need a vision for your organization that's bigger than just brand. That's actually what I do a lot of times is we do these like 1 day workshops. We do a half day vision session and then we do a half day brand articulation session. And that vision session, like you have to know what that is to really articulate your brand. Otherwise, it's like, why are you building this brand? You don't even know where you're going. Like the brand is a building block to get you somewhere, where whatever that vision is. So looking at, like things like a 1, 3, 5 year vision. Where are you now? Where do you want to be in a year? Where do you want to be in 3, 5 years? Applying that to all different aspects like financially, market size and share, product line, what your business model is. Why are you even doing this? Like, is this like a built to sell model? Are you doing this? It's like you want to, have like have passive income, build a product, be able to just sit back and let it sell. Like what's your business model even? So yeah, I always like to spend a lot of time up front making sure there's clear vision for the organization because the brand is going to be in support of getting from where you are now to where you want to be. And we need to have at least a decent understanding of where you want to be to make sure the brand is actually steering us in the right direction.
That's good. Defining, yeah. So I'm going to change gears just a little bit. So there's a bunch of different words or different types of marketing out there, and we encounter it. And I think as small business owners are kind of new to the business game, you hear these things. You're listening to podcasts, you're watching YouTube videos, you're like trying to absorb as much as you can to be your own in-house marketing agency of one. So I'm wondering if you can help give some context
Mhm.
to a few of these. Like I'm going to rattle off a bunch of names. You pick the ones you want to talk about. But then the question behind it is, what should we be focusing on? What are those small brands should be focusing of all these different types of marketing that we hear? Like what are the, I know we should be eventually focusing on all of them, but like if you could just distill it to the
Mhm.
kind of the cream to get started with. So there's brand. So we've talked about brand. So brand marketing, yeah, performance, content,
Mhm.
ambassador, influencer, community marketing, experience marketing, etc. So of those, and you could add more to it. Like where do you think of like, okay, don't waste your time there just yet. Pull it back and focus on these couple of things, and this is how you should do it.
Yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. You're kind of talking about you're starting to talk a little bit more about like the marketing execution and in terms of like where like okay, so let's just like use this example that we've been working on. Like we've got a clear vision, we've built our brand, We know who we are. We know like the reason we exist, and we have an idea of why that's going to resonate with people. Now we can start to think about how we're actually going to outwardly communicate that to the market. And this is where it kind of moves from branding to marketing, like you said. So what we would do in that kind of phase of this process is we would start to build out a marketing strategy. And that marketing strategy is really just thinking about how do you take that brand and start communicating and articulating it in all of the different consumer touch points and places that you're gonna meet your consumer and be able to influence them. Um, and then when you're talking about like the actual individual tactics, content, social media, print, website, et cetera, that's kind of more like media planning and the media mix or distribution like of your marketing materials into those different channels. So it's hard to say, it's hard to kind of sit here and give like a generic recommendation to say, focus on social, focus on content, focus on print, like because we would typically go through that whole process of building out a marketing strategy that comes back to like what's the concept or idea that we're communicating, who are we communicating it to with these target audiences, and then we can start to look at like where do those target audiences live, where can we meet them, where are they spending their time, and that's where I like to try and get away from, one of the things that just irks me so much in marketing, and like I see this with a lot of small brands, just because it's just what they know. It's just what they see. It's probably what they hear from a lot of people. They're like, okay, yeah, yeah, I got this product and I need to market it. Like I want to spend money on, I'm gonna do like meta ads. And I'm like, okay, yeah, sure, that's a channel. But why? Like, what are you gonna say? How are you gonna break through the noise? Who are you gonna target those ads to? And I'm personally not a huge believer in the obsession that the industry seems to have with digital advertising and the digital space. And like a lot of that I'm not saying there isn't a place for it. Like it's a massively important piece of the marketing mix, but it is like 10 years ago, sure. 10 years ago, it was a great way to communicate, like create some content, push it out on social. Now it's just like that space is so busy and cluttered and it's such a pay to play space and people's attention spans are so fleeting. It's so difficult to make a meaningful connection with a consumer through a Facebook or Instagram ad. There's value in them in different ways. But what I would really focus on with a startup, especially like somebody who's building a brand from the ground floor up, is like really think about where you can meet your consumer and solve their needs and provide something of true value to them that is going to make them love and appreciate you. And essentially interrupting something else they're trying to do with an ad is not going to be the place to start. So I would look at things like, okay, let's meet people where they are. So let's focus maybe even on like some geographically oriented, like physical activations, right? Okay, so here's just like a really like easy example. You come up with like I know Will at Spark R&D who developed essentially like it was essentially the guy that made split board bindings what they are today. And you've got this product, you got this sweet split board binding. How do you start selling that? Okay, you could go out and buy a bunch of Facebook ads and target people who are interested in split boarding, but like split boarding was still pretty young at that time. One of the things Will did is he just got really involved in the grassroots split board community and started sponsoring and facilitating a lot of the split board events like Split Fest at Mount Baker and stuff like that. And getting product in the hands of the consumer, getting out there and like like showing them there's a better way to do this, making their life easier and giving them a reason to be interested in their brand. Yeah, the digital side of it helps too. Like once you've done that, like continuing to make sure you're reminding them that you're out there and maybe marketing a specific binding that just got released or something like that on Facebook is great. But so yeah, looking at like physical activations, they're a sort of digital manifestation of that. It can also look at like content is huge, right? Everybody's obsessed with content, spending billions of dollars on producing videos and things like that, half of them which never get seen. So thinking about content, but thinking about it from an aspect of like how you're really creating value for the consumer. So is it through entertainment value? You're creating a piece of content that's going to be super entertaining for that consumer that they might sit down at night and be flicking through YouTube and find it and be like, yep, this is how I want to invest half an hour of my time instead of watching something on Netflix. Thinking about educational content, like go back to Will and Spark, like back then, a lot of people didn't really know how to split board, creating content about, how to do kick turns, like avalanche safety, things like that. Educational content that has value for the consumer. So that's kind of the foundation of content strategy is sitting down and looking at who the consumer is, what their content needs are, and planning content that meets them in that space. So yeah, content's huge. You hear a lot about content marketing, content strategy. There's a lot of challenges that come along with that too now as like the content space has become so crowded and anyone with a camera can go out there and produce pretty high quality content now. The sort of gatekeeper model of content creation that used to provide the real opportunity for brands to kind of break through the noise is gotten much harder as the gatekeeper has been just completely removed. Then you have YouTube and all that stuff. Um, but I think like one of the things that to specifically talk about some of the people that may be listening to this that are younger brands in the outdoor space, maybe product oriented, and are looking for ways to kind of reach their consumer, I would definitely focus on at least a fairly heavy investment in ambassador marketing, influencer marketing. I don't like that term as much, but I prefer to call it ambassador marketing. But really going out there, looking at the community that you're trying to reach, looking at people that are in that community and people look up to in that community, um, and finding an authentic fit with ambassadors where I'm definitely not talking about just going out and paying somebody to talk about how great you are, like creating real relationships with people who are influential in the community. We can call it influencers if we want, but it's not what I think of when I think of influencers. I think of like the influencers in the wild account and I cringe. But yeah, finding people who are influential in their communities, building genuine relationships with them, providing them with product, looping them into your R&D process, getting their feedback, and then figuring out ways to partner with them to help get your message out there. So really great example of that. Like talked, you and I have talked a little bit about our shared passion or interest in hunting. We've got Weatherby rifles out of firearms out of Wyoming, and they've just done a really good job of going out there, finding people in their space that are that share kind of their like firearms is a weird space, right? You got everything from like the super tactical like GI Joe guys to guys that just like to hunt and just need a rifle. And they've gone out there and found a team of ambassadors that are really kind of share their ethos for what firearms are, how firearms, the place that firearms should occupy in our lives, in our society, etc. And that are a positive, role model or messaging of that and have found a really good team of people doing that. Now, they're obviously also thinking about how influential those people are. They're looking at, guys like the Meat Eater crew. They're looking at guys like the Gritty Films crew. Big fan of Gritty Films for anyone that's interested in hunting and what those guys are doing. I think they're a really good example of what you talked about earlier, like building a brand when you don't even have a product. The Gritty guys did a really good job of that. But they've gone out and found people that are influential in their space that have reach into their audiences. They've found things to connect around, shared values, and they found mutually beneficial ways of helping each other in their goals and their what they're trying to do. So that is a really big channel for startups, and a lot of times, if you're starting at the ground floor, like you can do it affordably too. If you're finding people, like you're not necessarily going out and finding the Travis Rices of snowboarding, right? Like that's a big expense if you want to get those guys on board. But go out in your communities, find the grassroots people that are doing the heavy lifting, that have influence, work with those guys, create real authentic relationships with them, bring them into your R&D process, all of those things that I said. And I think people will see a lot of success in that
It's
model.
interesting that going back to what you were talking about a little bit earlier in your example of like kind of the building blocks of a brand, it seems like you can kind of sum a lot of it up into like building a community, right? Like you're trying to build a
Yeah,
community
yeah,
in
yeah,
person, like in person activations, online, and then this idea of finding the right ambassadors that fit for you.
yeah.
Somebody who I think is doing this really well. They're actually the first people I interviewed. Episode 1 is Bivo Bottles. They're out of Vermont. They're a good example. So I'll
Hmm.
link to them in the show notes. But they're a good example of they're
Yeah,
literally
cool.
building. They're going out to bike races and events in Nordic, anywhere that their potential customer could be using it, and they're just sporting. Before they even had a product, they would have bike wash stands at cyclocross races in the Pacific Northwest. They didn't have a product yet, and they were just
Yeah,
building a community and
yeah,
building this
yeah.
like affinity for the idea of this brand. And then yeah, they have a really successful ambassador program, of which you would maybe recognize a few of the names, maybe if you were, into
Hmm.
cycling and Nordic skiing, but they're finding the right ones.
But in those individual communities, those people know who they are. Like, me living on the West Coast may not know who that guy in Vermont is, but those people, to that community in Vermont where they're focused, or let's say they're focused in whatever other geographic market they see an opportunity, they found the right person there. Yeah, I mean, 100%, dude. That's bang on. And community is a word I use a lot, but really what it comes down to is like there's this idea of tribal brands. Brands are kind of tribal, and it comes back to consumer behavior and consumer psychology. Like humans, we need to feel a sense of belonging, and we need to feel a sense of identity. And brands are a tool that consumers use to fulfill that. And the outdoor sport industry is like it's almost more so in that industry than a lot, because people define themselves by the sports that they participate in. Like you got people out there that say, "Yeah, I snowboard," and you got people out there that say, "I am a snowboarder." Right? It is a huge part of their identity. And when they look for a sense of belonging, they are, trying to find a group or a tribe of people that feel the same way and have the same passions as they do. And they end up in mountain towns or whatever it is that fulfills that and creates, that sense of belonging. But brands can really tap into that by creating a space or community or being part of that community and creating a tool for people that helps facilitate that need, that tribal need that humans have to connect around shared values and things that they believe in. And that's where it comes back to this idea of like purpose. And it's not what you sell, it's why you do it, because that is really where the value in branding is
Okay,
going
so
to
it
lie.
ties into this tribal brands idea, and I'm looking at the clock and I'm like almost at an hour, and I
Yeah.
realize that I may be asking for trouble here. But one of the topics that you and I connected on previously is the idea of hunting, and you mentioned that a second ago. And there's some really cool
Mhm.
things that are happening, and it's happening in trail running too. But I think it's really interesting in hunt, and to some regards a little bit in
Mhm.
fish too. Um, that I think outdoor brands in general, I think we're going to start to see some more crossovers, and hopefully we do that. You know, blasting cast
Totally.
is going to be actually brought into more of the outdoor, because quite frankly, when you look at what's happening, I'm way more interested in what people are doing in the branding and marketing of blasting cast than outdoor right now. It's way more interesting. That could be just where,
I like that blast and cast.
well, hook and bullet. I like blick.
Hook and bullet was I like blast and
Yeah,
cast
blasting
better.
cast is a little bit more fun. Yeah, so it may be where my mind goes. So it's like confirmation bias or something like that. But I want to tee you up a little bit, just to, like, I know you could go on for this for an hour, but are there any things in that I just mentioned that you're like, yep, let's talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just so many case studies in hunting right now that are relevant, and largely because like the hunting industry is not new, but the hunting industry has undergone a massive change in the last decade, where it's kind of there's been some majorly influential people in that space, like Ranella, the Meat crew, and is kind of probably one of the most responsible for it. But the public perception of hunting is changing, but also the hunting consumer has changed dramatically from like what you think about the sort of like 70s, 80s, like guy in his mossy oak driving around in a truck, crushing tall cans, shooting at whatever moves. Like there's I'm not saying I'm not saying that it's a new thing that people are focused on ethical, sustainable hunting. Like there's always been that, but the perception and the way that the that hunting portrays itself has changed dramatically with a focus on ethical hunting, sustainability, adventure hunting. Like that's really become a kind of core aspect of the industry. Um, so I lived in Bozeman, Montana for almost a decade. That just so happens to be in a lot of ways like a hub of where a lot of this new kind of hunting industry is based out of. You got Sitka, Stone Glacier, fishing as well. You got Sims. Like it's a cool town, cool hub for hunting and fishing. And I've seen a lot of really strong brands grow out of that change in the industry and being kind of early adopters to understand the both the shift in the consumer mentality and the shift in like the public perception and be able to how they're influencing that through content and all kinds of things like that. But I guess like a nice way to kind of sum up everything we've talked about in a case study would be look at I'm just thinking someone like the brand called Stone Glacier. Um, so this guy Kurt, believe he was like guiding up in Alaska, or he's got a big AK connection, and I think he just really saw the need for a better pack and saw an opportunity to create something that just helped pack out these like heavy loads in these gnarly environments better. And I think, he's a tinkerer. Like he sat down and started playing with different fabrics and different techniques for bearing weight in a pack, and created what I still think is like one of the best backpacks out there. I use them. They're like, especially if you're paying Canadian dollars, they're like $900 backpacks, but they save your back when you're packing 100 pounds of meat. So it's worth it in my book. Um, but yeah, he started out there, created a really strong product, was able to connect with people in the industry, the Meat Eater crew, like a bunch of other like Remy Warren, like people like that are influential in the space, was able to do that and spent some time and money building good quality content as well, telling some really interesting like adventure hunt stories and creating good films, investing with high quality content creators, and then had like a foundational ethos to their brand that is like this focus on innovation and ultralight hunting, right? So then they were able to expand from packs to tents and ultimately to what's arguably the most profitable aspect of any of these industries, soft goods, because people just love to buy soft goods. And to be able to create soft goods in an industry that was already flooded with a lot of soft goods and become a viable competitor to these like major brands like Sitka, like that's a WL Gore brand, right? Like those guys are huge, and become a viable competitor to them and do things in a really cool way. Like they don't make camo. I love that. Like there's a place and time for camo. Don't get me wrong. I hunt in solids a lot of the time. It's just like I can wear it out and about and people don't look at me like I'm a psycho. Not like, I can park on the side of the highway and hop out of my truck and my solids and dip off into my spot, and people aren't like, "Oh my god, there's a guy in camo with a gun on the side of the highway." And but they have kind of an ethos that's like their thing is like, "Hey, look, we don't think that camo is a requirement for the type of hunting we do. We're doing big backcountry adventure hunts. We're putting stalks on animals thousands of yards. We're creating solid patterns that we think basically this ethos, if you're relying on camo to be the reason that you're able to get close enough to the animal to kill him, like you've already done 10 things wrong." So there's just different parts of their ethos that are really cool. Like that personally resonates with me a lot. I love that brand. Something we didn't talk about, like kind of touched on it with the Billabong Quicksilver Vulcan thing, but that private equity or ownership group model in outdoors, it's like it ultimately ends up killing a lot of brands. Remains to be seen how Stone Glacier does, but they were acquired a few years back by a larger holding company. I think the combination of the people at Stone Glacier and the people at the holding company are doing a pretty good job of maintaining a core element to that brand and its identity while still growing the brand slowly and sustainably. Like they're looking at doing a few things like kind of more leisure wear or whatever you want to call it, everyday wear, because they know that like people like me who love that brand will be happy to wear a set of Stone Glacier pants that aren't necessarily hunting pants or flannel or whatever. So they have managed to build a brand with a strong foundation, market it through some really solid marketing strategy, ambassador marketing, content marketing, et cetera, grow the product line to broaden their reach into the market, grow the organization to a point where they were acquired by a larger holding company. And I don't know the intricacies of that deal. I don't know who walked away with what, but like people made money. And again, it remains to be seen, but it appears to me that they are doing a good job of holding on to that core brand equity as they grow. You can look at that compared to First Light, another hunting brand. I would argue that for me personally, I was a real big fan of First Light for a long time and what they were doing. First Light, they're getting a little bit lost. I might upset some people here, but they have taken like they've broadened their focus in hunting. They started really like being like a Western hunting brand. They're making a lot of whitetail gear now. They're making a lot of turkey hunting gear. They're doing a lot of different camo patterns. Their content is like really dispersed. It's harder to for me to sit down and look at a First Light YouTube channel and find content that's interesting to me as like a Western backcountry hunter. So they've grown. I'm not saying they're not doing well, but their brand, I think, is at a little bit of risk of starting to become watered down by being too much, doing too much, and not having like maybe losing a little bit of that connection to their roots and what they're founded on. Again, I still think it's a solid brand. They're doing really well with what they're doing. It's a difficult space that they're in, but it's an example of how if you aren't careful, I'm not even saying they're doing the wrong thing, but if you aren't careful and you start chasing every market opportunity out there, and you aren't careful enough about how you ensure that is connected to your authentic purpose and the ethos of your brand, you can get lost, right?
It goes back to
So
what you're. Sorry,
for me,
go ahead and finish.
I was just saying for me personally as a consumer, like Stone Glacier still resonates with me much more than First Light does. I still buy First Light gear and wear it. Like it's good gear. But my preference is to Stone Glacier because they are staying really true to what resonated with me
Yeah, I mean it's
originally.
interesting because First Light got acquired by Meat Eater, which is now owned pretty much a majority is owned by a private equity firm. So kind of going back to something you touched
Yeah,
on, at the top of the hour of the conversation is that so many brands we're seeing the results of brands chasing quarterly earnings, and this is
yeah,
what happens. You get this like
totally.
dilution of content, dilution of product, and typically
Yeah,
the more you do, the less quality comes out. And so
yeah,
maybe that's just a good
yeah.
example of and that's the hard part. It's like I don't want to fault brands for taking the bag and walking away.
Gross.
Or
Yeah.
if you're the founder and you're
No,
like
it's
going to
gross.
sell.
Like it's like, well, what are we? Yeah, why are we here to do? What are we doing anyway? We're trying to make a bit of money, but again, like purpose needs to be part of that. But yeah, I mean, look, like we could do a whole other podcast talking about because to be totally honest, building startup brands and that are like driven by core niche markets and products, that's my favorite thing to do. It's fun. It's also like it's I'm not saying it's easy, but it's like there's a lot of low hanging fruit that you can do just with some basic investment in branding. The harder thing to do is to jump in to a brand. Like there's a brand life cycle, right? Think of it like a bell curve. You got the start of your brand where nobody knows about you. You're not doing a lot of sales, et cetera, and that brand becomes more successful. They hit that kind of peak of that bell curve where it's like, we're killing it. We're the most successful we've ever been. And what you pretty much always see, it's very rare that this doesn't happen, is that brand hits a peak of that bell curve and they start to tail off and eventually they die. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why, like why that happens. But one of the major aspects of it is private equity or whatever, they do an IPO or whatever it is, as people start they see an opportunity with a brand at the peak of the bell curve, they try and jump on it. The nature of investing is people expect returns and they usually don't want to wait and they start putting all these pressures on and that ultimately kills. So it's much harder to jump into a brand like Arc'teryx or the North Face or someone like that. That's like I think Arc'teryx is probably a better example than the North Face because I would say North Face is already long past the peak of that bell curve. Arc'teryx probably passed it too. So you jump in, you're kind of looking at that peak of the bell curve. The people in the marketing team there who are good people and probably have a lot of good ideas, but they're facing a lot of pressures. And you sit there and you're like, how do we grow this like without completely diluting the brand, or how do we rescue this brand, bring it back to its roots, and make sure we don't completely alienate our core audience by our entire brand now becoming known for like influencers in London wearing Gore-Tex jackets in the shower on TikTok videos. You're like, that's a little different than like the hardcore rock climbing company that we started as. How do you it's harder to jump in at that phase in a brand's life cycle and turn things around. So again, a whole nother podcast could be done on talking about the problems of the outdoor industry and the issues with short-termism. But to bring that back to branding, really just reemphasize like branding is a long-term strategy. It is not something you do and expect returns in a year, like 2 years. Like people always want to calculate the ROI. I get it, but branding takes time, and the ROI on your brand is the $1 trillion brand equity valuation that Apple has out of their $3.5 trillion market cap, right? Like if 30 years ago or whenever it was that Apple started and they were like looking to calculate the ROI on that in the early days when they were doing all kinds of crazy stuff that like probably would have made no sense to shareholders, nobody would have seen ROI on that. But what they've continued to do is built that equity. So, um, yeah, maybe that's kind of a nice little way to wrap up, is to bring it back to just this idea that branding is a long-term strategy. It's something like fundamentally, I think you have to do it, or you're hamstringing yourself in the long term, because you might have the best product on the planet, but somebody's going to come along tomorrow and either rip it off or build a better one. And how are you going to get past that? The answer to that question is because you're invested in branding over the long term, and people are loyal to you in the same way that I'm loyal to Stone Glacier, because they're staying true to what they do and all that kind of
It's
stuff.
awesome. Andy, that's a masterclass. I always end these conversations with one question. So I'm obligated to ask you, how do you define success for yourself?
Totally. Hmm. Just throw in the
The deep
throw in
philosophical
the
question at the
the
end of the
the, the
conversation.
deep philosophical existential question. Man. Well, you know what? Without going too deep and getting too personal, I've been on a journey in that regard, and it's largely why I am where I am today, of trying to figure out what that looks like. And I spent 15 years working in the agency world for other people and busting my ass to grow businesses and things like that. And when I first started, I was super passionate about advertising and marketing, and I love the outdoors, and I was so happy to be working in that industry. And after over a decade of doing it, you start becoming a little jaded. You start realizing you're like, yeah, it's cool. I'm selling snowboards and jackets, but I'm still doing the same emails and spreadsheets and crap that I would be doing if I was selling plastic fence or something. So, yeah, I went down a journey of kind of trying to get a better understanding of what my purpose was and what success looked like for me. And for a long time, I thought it was my career. I thought it was being being successful in my career. Like this is relevant to branding. Like we all have our own personal brands too, and our own personal purposes and our own personal identities. And my career and what I did was a huge part of my identity. As people would be like, "Tell me about yourself." You'd be like, "Well, this is what I do." Um, that kind of broke me after like 15 years of doing it. I just wasn't into it anymore. I thought about just completely getting out of the game. I did for a little while. I stepped back and just became a carpenter for a couple of years because I was just over it. But it was largely facilitated by the birth of my first child, my son, my oldest son, and that gave me an opportunity to step away and completely redefine my purpose in this world. It's kind of a cliche, but that's it's true. And that gave me the opportunity to step away, focus on doing something different, take some time away, realize the value that I could provide to some of these organizations on my own, without a big agency backing me, and was able to grow my business, my consulting business. And so, to answer your question, what is success for me? It's sustainable growth and balance, and it is like it's not to say that I'm still not focused on my career and focused on growing my business and all of that, but I'm really focused on doing that in a sustainable way that allows me to um, balance my priority focus on my family, my passions, and the role that work plays in that, as a means to an ends, as opposed to the ends in and of
Nice.
itself.
Well, I'm glad you've arrived there,
Yeah.
and I wish you more of that success.
Hey, I'm still
Well, you've
figuring it
arrived at
out.
the
I'm not,
you've recognized it. Like,
yeah. You asked me what success is. I didn't say I'm successful
well,
yet,
I would
but
say,
I'm
yeah.
working
Well,
on
we grew up in the
it.
GI Joe era, so knowing's half the battle. And if you know what success is for you, because
Yeah,
I think that's the issue that we run
totally.
into, is that a lot of us don't define success. We just don't even create it. And so
Yeah.
then,
Or you do, like maybe you do when you're 20 and or you have a vision and then like this is what happened to me. Like I woke up one day and I was like, man, if like 20-year-old me was looking at what I'm doing right now, like traveling around North America to all these ski resorts, like bringing my mountain bike, my snowboard, and like meeting with like C-suite people for these like resorts and brands and stuff like that, I'd be like, yeah, you made it. But I was like in my mid 30s and I was like, so kind of over this. Like, so like, yeah, that's it too, right? Like success evolves throughout your life. And I think you constantly have to be reevaluating your vision, thinking about where you want to be 1, 3, 5 years, or whatever, right? But yeah, it's an evolving milestone
nice.
too.
Well, Andy, I appreciate it, man. If people
Yeah.
want to get in touch with you and learn more about you, or just connect and check out your services, where can they find you?
Yeah, yeah. Check me out. My website's blackramconsulting.com. Black Ram. And yep, you can find me on LinkedIn, Andy Bethune. Shoot me an email, hello@blackramconsulting.com, whatever you want to do. But yeah, I love chatting with people, especially people in the startup phase, because I've seen a lot of successes and seen a lot of failures. And like like I was talking about the guy I chatted with the other day, who wanted to start that sailing brand. Like we talked for an hour and a half. There's I'm pretty confident it's not going to go anywhere, but I'm just happy to chat with the guy and give him some thoughts because I want to see people succeed. So yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to me. If you don't have any money, reach out to me anyway. I love just chatting and meeting
Okay,
people.
be,
So
be careful what you offer here,
yeah.
Andy. A lot of dirt bags
Yeah,
listen to this.
yeah. Yeah,
All
fair
right, man.
enough. Well, I'm a
Right on.
dirtbag, so
Cool, man. Well,
yeah,
we appreciate it.
know the deal. All right. Thanks
Yeah.
a lot, man. Appreciate it.